Well, good morning. Welcome. We have some visitors today, and we're really glad you are here. We started something last week that I hope that we'll be able to continue, and sometimes we'll do it purposely in our assembly. Sometimes we just want it to be something that we do because it's just part of who we are. And I want to recap a little bit from that from last week. Last week we started by welcoming 3 people who were sitting next to us. And so we're going to do that again this week just as a reminder, and because we have some people that weren't here last week. And we also want to make sure that as a congregation, as a church, that no one ever comes here, whether member or visitor, and leaves without being made to feel valued and welcomed and loved. And so that's something that we need to all work on together in the coming year. We started that last week. So what we did last week, if you weren't here, is this. We had everybody who could stand up, and I'll ask you to do that in just a minute. And then we want you to welcome 3 people that are fairly close by you, and do that by simply saying, "I'm really glad you're here today." And then if you don't know them, or they don't know you, to introduce yourself, give them your name, and then, just say, "I'm really glad you're here today." And once you've greeted and welcomed your 3 people, then just sit back down, and once everybody's seated, then I'll know that we've accomplished that goal. We had a few that were a little talkative last week, and that's okay. We did a little extra welcoming, and I'm glad of that. So we want to do that again this week, and there's a reason for that. And again, if you were here last week, you kind of hopefully got a gist of what that was, and I'll mention that again in a minute. So if you're able to, everybody stand up, and again, find 3 people close by. "I'm really glad you're here today." Make sure that you introduce yourself. Ernest, really glad you're here today, my friend.
Thank you.
My name's Tim.
Glad you're here.
Glad you're here today, too. Liz, glad you're here today, honey. Really glad. Glad you brought that handsome guy with you, too.
Okay.
I think that was good. It sounded like it was anyway. So again, even though we may not intentionally do that every week, we want to make sure we will do it from time to time as a reminder, but we hope that as people come in and as you come in the auditorium to worship, that you'll just naturally feel comfortable to go up and just tell people that you're glad that they're here, because hopefully we are glad that each person is here today, and that we want them to come back, and we want to make sure that at the end of the service that each person has been made to feel uplifted in the presence here. Last week we also talked about kind of a challenge for 2020, and it really focused on 2 things. It's focused on us being kinder, practicing more kindness and more encouragement for one another and to people that we meet, even people who may be strangers. There's enough hatred, and there's enough evil, and there's enough just negativity in our world. We need to be able to be people who are kind and who encourage others, because there's a purpose in doing that, and we'll get into that even more today. And so whether it's a friend, a stranger, a family member, a neighbor, a coworker, we encouraged you last week that every day you try to be kind and encouraging to at least 3 people. At least 3. Now, you've got 24 hours to do that every day, and so do I. And it doesn't take very long. In fact, in a matter of a couple minutes, we did some of that this morning. But in doing so, here's what we want to try to do, because when we started to put a little math together last week, we said that if we do 3 a day, each person, by the end of 2020, we could have the opportunity to impact 1,100 people. Just one person can do that. 1,100, just by simply showing a little act of kindness or encouragement to them. But then we took it a little further and we said, you know, if we do that as a congregation, if we look at the number at 150 people in this congregation, and we multiply that 1,100 by 150, that in 2020, we have the potential to impact 165,000 people as a church. 165,000, more than who live in Rockford. You could probably throw Loves Park or Machesney Park in there as well, but we have that much impact that we could do just by being kind, just by showing some encouragement to one another. And it could be by speaking to them personally or by writing to them, sending a card or a text or an email or a tweet or a whatever twig or whatever it is that people do these days. Make a phone call. But the idea is to be intentional. And if we're not intentional, then we'll never be successful. But if we're intentional, we'll be more neighborly, just like what we had read last week in Matthew 22, when Jesus said, as part of that greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so by being kind and being encouraging, all we're doing really is to share with others what we would like have happened to us. And so we talked about that last week, and we talked about that impact. And we also looked at something that Paul wrote to us to help us be more neighborly. He said in Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 29, and we went through chapter 5, verse 2, some things to get rid of in our life. Some things that we need to subtract that just aren't neighborly. They aren't very nice. They aren't very encouraging. They aren't very loving. And then he went on to give us several things that we should add to our life in order to be more neighborly, in order to be more kind, in order to be more encouraging, in order to love our neighbors as ourselves. So if you weren't here last week or if you'd forgot about that, I just encourage you this week to just go to Ephesians 4, start with verse 29 and read through the second verse of chapter 5, just as a reminder. And so what we did last week really has brought us to what I want us to focus on today, because there was another thing that was missing last week, that really all these things that we will do, if we all do what we said we're going to do, and 3 people a day and 165,000 people potentially in a year for this group, it won't work if we don't include one thing. And that really gets us to the title of the lesson today: The Lord Sure Does Move in Mysterious Ways. Now, you may find you may think that's a verse in the Bible, but it is not. At least not in those terms anyway. There are references to that, but not in those terms. But I could remember when I first heard that expression. I was 8 years old. I was laying in a hospital bed because I just had my tonsils out, and it was the week of Thanksgiving. Now, not a place you want to be during Thanksgiving. But they really took great care of us, because for Thanksgiving dinner that day in the hospital, they gave us turkey broth. And they gave us this little square of vanilla ice cream that in the center had a chocolate ice cream shape of a turkey. And that was my Thanksgiving dinner at age 8. But while I was in the hospital that day, the movie Sergeant York came on TV. And if you haven't ever seen the movie Sergeant York, sometime I would encourage you to do that. It's based on a true story of an American hero from World War I, Alvin York. And that was where I first heard this expression, because a couple times in the movie, Sergeant York, who was played by Gary Cooper, said those very words. And so they've stuck with me 54 years since. The Lord sure does move in mysterious ways. And maybe thinking today in your life, you can think of times right now where you may have thought that same thing, or experienced that same thing where you thought, wow, the Lord sure does move in mysterious ways. And so I want us to look at that today, because I feel like it's important to what we talked about last week, because it's the key. I mean, we can be as kind as we want to be, but if we don't include God in that formula, then it's not going to be as successful as we would hope it to be. So I want us to look at this today. And you see, here's what I want us to do. I think it's important if we're going to focus on kindness, if we're going to focus on encouraging others, we need to make room for God. We need to make room for God to work in us and through us in 2020. When we're welcoming people, when we're encouraging them, when we're being kind to them, we need to make room for God to work in us and through us with those words and those things that we do. And then we also need to make room for God to work in the lives of the people who we're neighborly to. Because God can do both of those things, and without Him working in our lives and in their lives, really, that exercise, that challenge for 2020 will not be as successful. And you may think last week, if you were here, that, well, how does saying good morning to somebody or opening the door for them or taking their grocery cart back to the rack at the grocery store, how is that really going to impact somebody? And maybe in and of itself, maybe it doesn't. But it does if we make room for God. If we make room for God to work in us, and we make room for God to work in them. You see, today, maybe that little act of kindness, maybe that's pretty comfortable for us to say, well, have a nice day, and really mean it. And that's good. But if we let God work through us, maybe it gets to be more than that. Maybe we become more comfortable in saying other things to people and doing other acts of kindness and encouragement throughout the coming year. In fact, I would say that if we do this, if we leave room for God, if we make room for God in our lives, here's some things that I think He can do. I think He can help us get to a point where we might invite someone to worship services. We might go beyond just have a good day. We might get comfortable and say, you know, I'd love for you to come to worship with us some Sunday. If we make room for God in our lives, we might be able to just get to a point where we say to them, instead of just have a nice day, you know what, God really loves you. God can do that if we let Him work in our lives. He can also do this. He can also work in us to where we might offer to pray for someone or pray with them and then do it. Because He's helped us get past maybe any anxiety, any nervousness, any hesitancy we might have as we keep growing. He might also be able to work in us and get to us to a point where we invite someone to our home where we can get to know them better. Or maybe even to start a Bible study with them, or to invite them to a life group, or maybe even meet with them for coffee, something to take that initial kindness, that initial encouragement, and take it to another level. God can do that if we let Him work through us. But even beyond that, He can do this too. He can work in the lives of the people that we touch, the people that we impact, the people that we're kind to the point where God and only God can soften someone's heart. God and only God can open someone's mind. He can create a spark in someone, and He can fan that spark into a flame within their heart and within their lives. And He can bring someone to the point of asking for help. He can even go even further, and this is where it gets really personal and really the rubber meets the road. He can help someone in their lives look at us, look at you, and look at me, and maybe see a difference in the life of one of us that they don't see in someone else, and ask why. And also, God can work in the lives of others to get them to a point to maybe realize that what's lacking in their life is Jesus. And all it needs to do is start with maybe, good morning. Hope you have a nice day. Because we just need to make sure that we allow room for God to work. And I truly believe that that's possible. I think that if each of us are intentional in doing those acts of kindness, in doing those things of encouragement, that God will open doors for us in 2020, that He'll help us be successful. But without Him, we won't be. You know, the Apostle Paul, he wrote in Romans chapter 11, beginning in verse 33, and he quotes here from Isaiah and from Job, but he says this, he says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable His judgments and His paths beyond tracing out! Who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay him? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. You see, God's ways are not our ways. God's ways are so much greater. What he can do is so much greater than anything that we could ever imagine. Who are we to ever give counsel to God? Who are we to understand everything? But if we trust in him, he'll work in us and through us. Last week, I mentioned already that Matthew 22, beginning with verse 34, was kind of the scripture reading and really what we based the lesson on last week. And it had to do with Jesus answering the question about what was the greatest command. And he said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And that the second half of that is just like the first, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so last week, we focused on that second half, that loving your neighbor as yourself, that idea of being kind and being encouraging. Well, this morning I want us to look a little bit deeper at that first part, because I think it's, if we're going to say that we love God with all of our heart and our soul and our mind, we can only do that if we put our full trust in him. We have to be able to say that we trust God to work in our lives. We trust God to work in mysterious ways. We can't really say that I love God and then doubt what his capabilities are. In fact, as we think about that, loving God is really trusting in God, trusting in him totally. It's trusting in God, and we can't claim to have faith in God and not believe he can do all things. If we trust in God, we can't claim and make requests to him in prayer and then wonder why he hasn't answered them. Come on, God. I've been praying for this for a week. No, if we trust in God, if we say we love God, and we put our trust in him, we can't be making requests and then wonder, well, how come he hasn't answered them yet? We need to let him move in his ways. Also, we can't blame him for unfortunate circumstances that happen in our lives. If we put our trust in God, we can't do that and not say that we love him. And then we can't focus on kindness and on encouragement and then question if it's even worth our time or attention. You see, if we question those things, then we're not putting our trust in God. We're not putting our love in God to action, because we've got to believe that God will move in his ways, and they may be mysterious to us. Solomon said this in Proverbs chapter 3. He said, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." Solomon, the wise man, he knew where he needed to put his trust. David would write in Psalm 20, verse 7, "Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." David lived in a time where military might was significant. It was important. It was the way you survived. And so many of those kingdoms that would rise up against Israel counted on the fact that they had more soldiers, or they had more horses, or more chariots, or more military might. But David, King David, said, no, we're not going to put our trust in that. We are going to trust in the Lord. And we need to do that in 2020 as well. And then David went on to say this in Psalm 25. He said, "To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. In you I trust, O my God. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one whose hope is in you will ever be put to shame, but they will be put to shame who are treacherous without excuses. Show me your ways, O Lord, teach me your paths. Guide me in your truth and teach me, for you are my God and my Savior, and my hope is in you all day long." David knew where he needed to put his trust, and we need to follow that example in 2020. I want to share a personal example with you for a minute that I think helps illustrate it, and probably each of you may have those personal examples of how you would look back and say, wow, the Lord sure moved in a mysterious way there. And this one was real, and it was something that we came to acknowledge, Kathy and I, long before I ever thought of this sermon. And hopefully it's one of those where I get through it where I don't, lose everything. So, for probably the last 4 years, Kathy and I were very much about praying that God would provide Sarah, our oldest daughter, a better opportunity. She was working as a teacher in a small town in Arma, Kansas, and was doing fine, but there just wasn't a lot of opportunity for her in a lot of different ways. And so, as time went by, she expressed a desire to want to move to Springfield, Missouri. And so our focus and our prayers became, Lord, provide some opportunities for her in Springfield, Missouri area to where she could go and get a job because it would be better for her. And there were a few interviews, and there was even an offer, but it just didn't materialize. And so we continued to pray, and as time went by, other opportunities presented themselves, even an opportunity to interview for a teaching job at Harlem High School, and we got our hopes really high. Some of you did too. But that didn't work out. And after the fact, it's probably like, well, okay, it just wasn't supposed to be. And then as time went by, a couple years ago, Sarah got a phone call from a principal at a school in Texas, not far from where Kaylee lives, her sister. And she expressed an interest in Sarah wanting to come to be her music teacher. And so, again, we thought this could be the thing. This could be the one. But right before Sarah actually went to interview, that principal changed schools. And so that opportunity didn't materialize. And then last summer, Sarah had some opportunities come up in Oklahoma City, because Oklahoma City's at least 2 or 3 hours from Dallas where Kaylee is. And so we wanted Sarah and Kaylee to be able to live close enough together that they could lean on each other, that they could be there for each other. So again, our prayers shifted again. Lord, provide some opportunity for her in Oklahoma City. So she had some interviews, and she even had a job offer, but that didn't seem to be the right thing either. And then, the end of spring last year, she got a call from Sally. Sally was the principal in Texas who had changed jobs right at the last minute last year, or the year before rather. Sally was at that new school that she went to, and her music teacher was retiring there. And she wanted Sarah to be her teacher, her music teacher. And so, again, we continued to pray that that would be the case. And as time went by, that happened. And Sarah we moved her this summer, and she lives 25 minutes from her sister, and they can lean on each other, and especially so far away from home. And so we thought, it was God's plan, not our plan. And we had to be patient with Him. And even every time that we would pray, it'd be, it's your will, God. You know what's best. Make it clear. Just be with Sarah and help her make the right decisions and not get discouraged. And so she loves where she's at, and she loves her job. And the thing that's even more unique about that is that Sally's mother, was a teacher at the school where Sarah went to work when she got out of college in Kansas. So Sarah got to know Susan as a teacher, as a co-worker in Arma, Kansas. She got to work with her for a few years before she retired. But then Susan, because she got to know Sarah, she introduced Sarah to her daughter Sally. And she even recommended Sarah to Sally when Sally had that opening. As I looked back on that, I wondered if that wasn't God's plan in place long before we even ever started to ask God to provide a better opportunity for Sarah. You see, we don't know what God has going on in our lives. We don't know what God has in store for us. All we know and need to do is put our trust in Him. Put our faith in Him and let him work in his ways. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. If we're to be successful in being kinder and more encouraging to others in 2020, to be more welcoming as a church, we need to put our trust in God. We need to say, God, I love you, and because I love you, I am going to trust you because your ways are greater than I could ever figure out. You see far ahead of what I could ever see. If we make room for God in 2020, here's what I think will happen. I think we need to trust in him fully. I think we need to believe in him completely. I think we need to have confidence in him totally. We need to love him with no limits. And we need to allow him to work continually, not only in our lives, but in the lives of those that we purposely impact for good. There may be limits to what we can do, but there are no limits to what God can do. And that's why we need to trust in him. We need to do what we can do and let God work in his mysterious ways for the good of all. This morning, we're going to sing a song. It's that song of encouragement that we do. And you may be here today and you may have been thinking about things for a while, and you may find yourself coming to a realization that, you know what, I need Jesus. And I haven't put him on in baptism. I haven't been the Christian I need to be. And so during the singing of this song, if that's something that you need to do and you want to do, then we'll help you do that. Or maybe it's just one of those things where you just need help, period. We can help you with that as well. We can pray for you. You see, again, we just need to let God work and watch how he can work in our lives. Let's stand together and let's sing.